Welcome to the first MAE Distinguished Lecture Series of the year. We have a star-studded lineup this year, so our speakers in the winter quarter will be Greg Ip of the Wall Street Journal, Stanley Fischer, formerly of the IMF, Citigroup, World Bank, Federal Reserve, and Bank of Israel, and the Nobel Prize winner Richard Thaler. In the winter, we will also kick off our new Business Leader Series. The speaker will be Lloyd Greif of Greif & Company. If you or your firm are interested in endowing the series, please let us know. Our speaker today is Edward Lazear, the Davies Family Professor of Economics at Stanford Graduate School of Business and the Morris Arnold and Nona Jean Cox Senior Fellow at Hoover. Eddie was chair of the Council of Economic Advisors from 2006 to 2009, when he had to deal with that small blip we know as the financial crisis. Eddie also is a renowned researcher who founded the field of personnel economics and who has written extensively about entrepreneurship. He also is an institution builder for the economics profession as a whole and for the institutions lucky enough to have him as a member. Most importantly, though, he is a UCLA BA/MA. So I will leave it now up to Eddie.
Well, thank you. It really is nice to be back. This building was here actually when I was here, and I was thinking, I hesitate to tell you how long ago it was, but it's actually I was an undergraduate here 50 years ago, so it's pretty amazing. Yeah, I kind of look back and Brew and Walk looks a little different. Some of the things look a little different. A few more buildings, but the Bunch Hall is still the same, still as beat up and nasty as ever. Took a lot of classes there, but it's not the physical structure that makes the difference. It's the faculty that's in it, and I certainly view my time at UCLA as having been formative and important. What I thought I would do today, I was told to give a general talk rather than a talk on my research. And so I thought what I would do is kind of give you the kind of stuff that I actually had to do in government, which is really talk about the overall economy and the general economy. In some ways, this borders more on macroeconomics than on microeconomics, but you'll see some of both. Lots of charts, lots of numbers, very little technical material, but I'll try to give you some of the technical background. I know it's a sort of a mixed group in here. Some of you obviously are on the faculty and highly technically trained economists. Some of you are from the business community, so hopefully I can mix it up a little bit. And what I'll try to do is keep it to hopefully 45 minutes or so, and then give you a half hour or so to ask questions for discussion, whatever you guys want to talk about. So let's get started. Okay, well, let's see. We'll get started if I can make this work. No, that's not the right way to do it. Hang on a sec. Let's see, page down. Anybody know how to make this thing move? Anybody know which button? Ooh, that worked. Okay, good. Okay, I figured it out. See, a UCLA BA actually does serve to teach you something. So, okay. So this is just a quick overview of where we are now, where the economy is right now. And this is pretty standard stuff, but if you look at these numbers, what you'll see are a couple of things. First of all, growth rates vary. The current year is above 3%, as you know, about 3.3% over the past few quarters. That growth rate is higher than we have had throughout the recovery. And, of course, President Trump likes to take credit for that. Whether that's true or not, we'll go through and see if we can analyze that. But it is true that the rate is higher. And if you look at where we're going to be over the next 4 quarters, let me just tell you a little story. You see that there's a forecast there, next 4 quarters, that green bar. And that's at about 2.5%. Now, how did I get that number? Well, I got that number because one of my jobs at the Council of Economic Advisors, the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, is ex officio the chief forecaster for the United States. Okay, that's actually part of my job. Was part of my job. Now, that doesn't mean I did it personally, but I oversaw a committee that we called Troika. Troika is as close to the United States model of the Soviet Union's 5-year plan as we get. It basically says we're going to go through and we're going to look at what the economy is going to do. And we would go through, and I had a guy who's still there, career civil servant, excellent person, excellent economist, and he would put together forecasts for the administration, Treasury Secretary, myself, and the head of Office of Management and Budget would go through and agree on the numbers that we thought going forward. After I got out of the government, I started looking back at some of the forecasts and what we did, and of course, the reality is we were terrible, okay? Now, we were terrible not because we weren't trying hard or because our methods weren't sound, but everybody's terrible at forecasting the economy. And so what I did was I looked at some data and I kind of thought about this and discovered that just as an empirical matter, the best forecast of the next 4 quarters is actually the S&P 500. So if you look at the change in the S&P 500 over the past 3 or 6 months, that'll give you the best forecast of where you're going forward. And there's an obvious conceptual reason for that if you think about it. The S&P 500 is incorporating new information as opposed to past information. So if there's a disaster, like, as was mentioned, I was there during the financial crisis, that stuff wasn't baked into the previous numbers. So if you were sitting there in September, while there were some things that had happened during the summer and in the previous quarters, the stuff that happened in September wouldn't be in the past numbers. They wouldn't be in the job numbers. They wouldn't have been in the GDP numbers. But the market picked that stuff up immediately. So they were immediately reflected in the S&P 500. And so for that reason, at least conceptually, it makes sense that one would look at the S&P 500. But it turns out that if you kind of go through it and do it empirically, at least as far as I could tell, that was the best predictor. Okay, so our growth throughout the recovery has been pretty weak, but it hasn't been that bad as compared with other G7 countries. So if you look at the United States and you see where are we, the recovery was about a 2.2% recovery, not very good, certainly not good by historic standards, but slightly above the UK and Canada and considerably above the other G7 countries. Even Germany, which we think of as the European powerhouse, only had a rate of about 1.5%. So in relative terms, we actually looked pretty good. Where are we now? Well, how many people know what the unemployment rate is in the United States today? Raise your hands if you know it. I won't call on you. Do you know it? Okay. All right. Well, I know it. It's 3.6. So I'm going to talk a little bit about labor markets. That's my expertise, and I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so, 5 to 10 minutes, talking about labor markets. Now, if you look at unemployment rates, it sure looks like we're at or well beyond full employment. 3.7% is as low as we've been in 50 years. And virtually every economist, we got some very distinguished macroeconomists in this room, I won't call on you either, but if I asked you and I said, what's what would you think of as a natural rate or the full employment rate, most people would probably put it somewhere around 4.5% to 5%, not 3.7%. So this is a very low rate. But I'm going to argue that we're not yet at full employment. And this graph kind of gives you a clue as to where we are. You notice it says full employment, and then it says, no, there is too much job creation. Also, you notice I used an exclamation point. You know where I got that? The president uses those on Twitter. So I thought, well, maybe that's a way to sell your stuff. So anyway, so put an exclamation point after anything you do. I went to lunch today, exclamation point. So anyway, but there is too much job creation. Now, what do I mean by too much? I mean, how can there be too much job creation? Essentially, the way to think about that is illustrated by this graph. So if you think about job creation over a business cycle, and you say, when do we have high levels of job creation? Again, think of it conceptually. You tend to have high levels of job creation when you're in the recovery phase. Why? Because you have to make up for jobs that were lost. And what do I mean by high? I mean rates of job creation that exceed the rate that would keep you level with population growth. So think about every month, new people are coming into the labor force. You have to have enough jobs to accommodate those new people. And if you do, then unemployment is going to be pretty much stable. But in a recovery, you've got to have rates of job creation that exceed the rate of population growth to make up for lost jobs. And conversely, when you're in a recession, when the economy's slowing down, what happens? Job creation is going to be below the rate that keeps up with population growth. And you actually see that in this graph. I don't have a pointer up here, but if you look at this and you look at the period around 2006, you'll see job creation was above the rate of population growth. That wiggly orange line is above the blue line. But then when you hit the peak of the business cycle, which was right around December of 2007, you're right at job creation that equals population growth. And then as you start to go into the recession, you'll see job creation below population growth. And then as you come out of the recovery, again, it crosses back over, and job creation is above population growth. So where is it now? It's above population growth. Right now, the number that would be necessary simply to keep up with a growing population is about 130 to 135,000 per month. Over the past few months, we've been growing at rates a little bit over 200,000. So that tells you that we're still growing at recovery rates. So that's what I mean by job creation is too high for us to be at full employment. Let me give you another number that bolsters that argument, and that is that the employment to population ratio is still too low. Now, what do I mean by too low? How do we know what is the appropriate employment to population ratio? Well, one thing we can do is we can look at the past. We can look at peaks during past booms and see where we were. If we do that, the peak for the employment to population ratio back in 2007 was at 63.4%, 63.5%. Right now, we are at 60.6%, so 3 percentage points below the peak of the last expansion. But there's something that's happened between the last expansion and now, and you know what it is? It's guys like me, baby boomers. We are getting old and we should be retiring. So I am still here talking to you, but if I had any sense, I wouldn't be. I'd be retired, like the rest of my cohort. And so what that means, of course, is that when a larger fraction of the working age population is in the retirement years, that means that the target level of the employment to population ratio is going to be lower. By the way, I didn't even define what that was. I'm sorry for those of you who are not quite as familiar with these numbers. The employment to population ratio counts the number of people who have jobs relative to the number of people in the working age population, where working age population is defined as anybody 16 and older. So 90-year-olds are in the working age population, which means, of course, that the number, the target number is never going to be 1. It's going to be something like 60%, because some of the people are like you in school, and some of the people are like some of my colleagues who, retired, okay? So the number then has to be corrected for the proportion of the population that is in that old cohort. And that's been growing over time because my parents and their friends had lots of babies. That's called the baby boom. And so what that means, of course, is that rather than going back to 63.5%, we're going to go back to a lower number. And that lower number is going to be something like 61%. That's kind of the demographics adjusted number. We're not quite there yet, but we're getting close. 60.6 is pretty close to 61%. There's another way to infer that, another piece of information that's important, and that's to look at people who are in the prime age workforce. What's prime age? Prime age means people between 25 and 54 years old. Now, what should be happening to those people? Those people should actually be working at higher rates than they were in the past. Why? Well, because if my generation is retiring, that creates an increased demand for people of that generation because they're substitutes for us, right? Or think about that, demand for substitutes, right? So demand for them should be going up. Their wages should be going up. They should actually have higher employment to population ratio. And in fact, they don't. What had happened was the employment to population ratio of that cohort actually went down during the recession. So the people who were actually working at high levels were my generation, not the generation behind me. And that was a bit of a surprise. And people thought, well, maybe they're just lazy, okay? Well, maybe they are, but I'm going to come to that in a minute, give you some evidence on it. What also has happened over time is that that number is now coming back. And in particular, over the past few months, since January, that number has jumped by 1 percentage point. So those younger people, middle-aged people, the prime age workers, are coming back into the labor force, and the most important re-entrants into the labor force, now working, who weren't before, were young men 25 to 34 years old. I see a bunch of you guys in this room, okay? So get out there and get a job. But no, the reality is that those people weren't working, and some people, some even very distinguished labor economists said, well, this is a structural problem, and they're just never coming back. And in fact, this was an important argument a few years ago, because the Federal Reserve, was thinking when they think about monetary policy, can they actually do anything about this problem? You know, you got people who are out of work. What can the Fed do to bring those people back in? Well, if it's a structural problem, if there's something inherently wrong with the labor force, the kinds of jobs that those young men would have been doing are no longer there, the Fed can't fix that problem. That's not something the Fed can do. But if it's simply a cyclical problem, then the Fed says, well, maybe we have some tools to deal with that. I'm not going to get into that debate, but you can certainly see why these numbers are important. And there were some people telling the Fed that, in fact, this is a structural problem. Those guys are never coming back. I disagreed. Actually, I wrote a paper on this back in 2012. I said I thought it was a cyclical problem. I won that battle, and the way I know I won that battle is we see those numbers coming back now. So actually, these people are coming back into the labor force. And I'm going to tell you why. Actually, before I tell you why, let me do one more, because this is interesting, and it speaks to the same issue of whether we're at full employment. There's one other thing that we can look at to find out whether we're at full employment. Again, this is important for monetary policy. So if you think about what the Fed is thinking about right now, what is Chairman Powell thinking about right now? He's thinking, is the economy overheating? And the easiest way to get a sense of whether the economy is overheating is to look at the labor market. There are other numbers they look at, but the labor market is by far the most important indicator of where the economy is. And so these guys are looking at that labor market and they're saying, are we overheating? So one of the things they worry about is inflation, right? The Fed's main target is inflation. I mean, they have a dual mandate, inflation and employment, as most of you know. But inflation is really the primary thing that they're supposed to be worried about. And one of the things that they worry about is whether the labor market is pushing up prices. If there's so much pressure, so much demand in the labor market that it's causing wages to grow that it's going to push up prices. So what this graph tells you is don't worry about it, not yet. Okay? And here's why it tells you that. What I have here are two lines. One line is the what I call the permissible wage inflation. What is permissible wage inflation? Well, permissible wage inflation is the sum of two components. It's the sum of the increase in productivity plus the Fed's target rate of inflation. Why did I do that? Well, here's why I did that. Productivity increases are not inflationary. Wage increases that match productivity are not inflationary. Why not? Because the output is going up. If the wages are going up at the same rate as output, all that says is that workers are getting their share of the additional output. That's all that means. Nothing wrong with that, no problem, no inflationary pressure. In addition to that, add on another 2 percentage points. Why? Because that's the Fed's target inflation rate. So if you added on 2 percentage points and you say, well, then where does that put us? If we've got 1% productivity growth and 2% allowed inflation, then that gives you 3%. Okay, so right now, actually, it's about 3.3%. The productivity growth's been about 1.3%. That puts us at 3.3% as permissible wage inflation. What's the actual wage inflation? It's about 3%. So just under. So still not there yet. So that's another indicator that the economy is not yet overheating. And this is kind of a useful way to think about it, because what it does is it combines Fed policy with some basic economics in terms of what we expect from productivity growth. All right, now I said I was going to talk about those young men. And this graph actually speaks to that because it talks about disability. Well, very few of the young men get disability insurance, very few. So why does this speak to the young men problem? You'll see why in a minute. If you look at this graph, what this shows you is the number of applicants, new applicants into the disability pool. So every month people apply for disability benefits. Everybody know what disability benefits is? It's part of the Social Security system. If you get disabled and you can no longer work, you can draw benefits early. The system just gives you benefits early to make up for your lost income. What you see is that the number of applicants for disability insurance follows the unemployment rate pretty darn closely. So when unemployment went up, what happened? Applicants into disability went up. Now, some people look at that. See, if you look back 2006, 2007, look to 2010, that was kind of the depth of the recession. Unemployment was really high. People were saying, I'm disabled, give me benefits, okay? And now you guys are chuckling, and I wanted that reaction because I knew you would be thinking that those guys are cheating. That's not what this graph says, okay? What this graph says is that people behave as rational economic agents. That's essentially what's going on here. So if you think about this, they may be cheating or not, I don't know, but this doesn't speak to cheating. Assume that no one is cheating, that you only take disability insurance when you're entitled to it, and that you actually are legally entitled to it, but not everybody takes disability insurance. Why? Well, suppose you have a really good job, and you have a back problem, like I happen to have, okay? But I have a really good job. So have I ever decided to go on disability benefits? No, of course not, because even though I probably would be able to qualify for disability benefits as a result of my back history, it's just so much fun doing what I do that I don't want to do that, okay? I don't want to take those benefits. Now, let the unemployment rate go up. What happens when the unemployment rate goes up? Well, now my options are no longer as good in the labor market. What do? I say, okay, well, now I don't have that alternative. Now look at what happens as the unemployment rate falls. What happens on the downside? People say, there are jobs out there. I'd rather work than be on disability. So what that tells you is people are responding to the incentives in the labor market. Now, I said that speaks to the young men. The reason it speaks to the young men is my interpretation of what's going on with the employment rates among young men is exactly this same phenomenon. When jobs become available, when the labor market is hot, when wages are rising, young men no longer choose to sit in their parents' basements and play video games. They'd rather actually go out and work. And so they are responding to the incentives in the labor market. If the jobs are available, if wages are there, the people go out and work. And that's what the numbers seem to be suggesting is going on. So that's basically the point. That's why I showed you the disability. It's not so much to focus on disability per se, but really to talk about incentives. Okay. I said I was going to talk for 10 minutes on labor markets. I actually talked for 15, but that's what I know the most about. So from here on out, I'm just winging it. Okay, so now what I want to talk about is deficits. This is actually based on data as well, though. So I want to ask a question. How many people in here think that deficits hurt growth, that they would hurt economic growth, bad for growth? Raise your hands. Okay. How many think goes the other way? Deficits help growth. Okay, so it goes the other way. All right. The rest of you are agnostic. All right, well, good. I'm glad that I got a mixture because there is some ambiguity there, both conceptually and empirically. The ambiguity comes from those people who think it hurts growth, primarily thinks that deficit hurt growth because it put pressure on capital markets, raises interest rates. Those things are bad for growth. That would be your natural reaction. If you were on the other side of that issue, you were probably thinking about stimulus. You were probably thinking about using deficits as a way to create demand in the economy, kind of in a standard Keynesian macro sense, and that's probably what you had in mind there. Okay, so let me show you the answer. Now, when I say the answer, this is based on OECD data, and I'm going to show you my data and show you how I get to this answer. So here's the answer. The answer is spending, not deficits, affect growth, but the way it works is that spending is correlated with taxes, and taxes do two things. One, they hurt investment and they hurt work. And I'm going to show you that empirically with 3 graphs. And by the way, this stuff is, if you're interested in this, this is backed up with real data and numbers, and all the data and numbers and regressions are on my Hoover website, so you can get access to this stuff if you want to follow this up further. But let me just show you a scatter plot of deficits and growth rates. So if you look at this, you see these dots are kind of all over the place, and I drew this line through it, and the line is a regression line, and it's pretty flat. It's slightly negative, but it's basically pretty flat. And you know, you can kind of see why. There are countries like Ireland that have very big deficits and have had very successful growth, very high growth rates. There are countries like Greece at the other corner, where they've had also very high deficits, but terrible growth. They've had a contraction, right? So we know you got those 2 points. Then go back to the other end, look at Korea. Korea is a country that has a negative deficit. In other words, it runs a surplus. And Korea's growth's been okay. It's been fine, good, not as good as it was at one point, but you know, kind of in the middle range, middle to high range. So again, you've got points all over the place, and so you see, if you just looked at this empirically, there wouldn't be any obvious thing that would jump out at you in terms of the relation between of growth to deficits. But let me show you the next graph. The next graph is spending and growth rates. And if you do that regression, that one is clearly negative. So there is no question that high spending countries have lower growth. Now I want you to look at some of these high spending countries. The high spending countries are among some of the richer countries in the data set. So just because you're a high spending country and you have low growth does not mean you have a poor economy or a poor society. Denmark, I spent a lot of time in Denmark. Denmark happens to be one of the dots up in the high spend, low growth area. Finland, another country like that. So Scandinavia, Austria, another place I like a lot. Really nice countries, you know, with great ski areas, all kinds of beautiful mountains, very rich societies. But they have had low growth. That's just the reality. They have high spending and low growth. Why do they have high spending? What's going on there? Is it because they're fighting wars or any of that stuff? No, obviously what's going on is they have a social structure where they have simply chosen as a basis of policy, that what they're going to do is run a lot of stuff through the government, meaning, you know, health care, and they're going to have lots of entitlements. It's a decision that those countries have made. They've simply decided that's the way they want to go. It's a conscious decision, so they're going to have a big government with lots of government spending, and they've done that consciously. Fine. A consequence of that, however, is that it does mean high taxes. Why? Well, remember when you had this puzzle about you know, should you have high deficits or low deficits? And there was some ambiguity there. Well, the reason there was an ambiguity is because it was hard to decide in your heads whether it was good to buy something on time, on credit, or whether it was good to pay cash. So let me give you an example. Let's suppose that you have a person who earns $2,000 take home per month and lives in West Los Angeles, okay? That's pretty tough. Living in West Los Angeles on $2,000 a month take home is going to be a tall order. Now let's suppose that she decides, she gets her paycheck and she goes down to Best Buy and she decides that she's going to buy a home entertainment system for $2,000. The question is it better for her to pay cash, or is it better for her to finance the thing over time? If she finances it, she's running a deficit, borrowing money, paying it off over time. If she pays cash, what she's essentially doing is raising her taxes right now and paying it off right now. Which is better? Well, it's not so obvious. If she pays it off cash, she doesn't have anything to live on for the next month. How's she going to pay for her rent, her bills, her food, so forth? If she pays it off over time, she's got this huge debt burden hanging over her. That's not so great either. What you do know, however, is she probably shouldn't have bought the thing in the first place, okay? So the point is, once you've committed to the spending, how you finance it is a second-order problem. It's not that it's irrelevant, but it's really a second-order problem. The first-order problem is, should you do the spending in the first place? So that's essentially what this graph is showing you. It's saying countries that have decided to spend, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, once they've decided to spend that money, they've got to pay for it. They're either going to pay for it right now through higher taxes, or they're going to pay for it later over time through higher taxes, but they are going to pay for it in the form of higher taxes. And that's what you see with this positively sloped line. High spending countries are also high tax countries. Eventually you have to pay for it, and that's what you see in the cross section. By the way, that doesn't reflect that's not a simultaneity thing. Sometimes I get asked about that. I'll just throw that out. This is cross-sectional evidence from a 6-year period. You can do it basically on any 6-year period. If you're looking at the cross-section, you don't tend to see the kind of simultaneity stuff that you would see over a business cycle. All right, so why do we care about high taxes? The reason we care about high taxes is two things. First, it has a negative effect on investment. I'm not showing you that here. Again, since I'm a labor economist, I'm going to focus on the labor side of things. But it does clearly have a negative effect on work. So what I'm plotting here is the hours worked per working age person against the tax rate. And so hours worked by working age person has two things in it, two things. One is, how long is the work week? But the other thing is, how likely are you to work? Because remember, if you're a working age person, you don't have to be working. You could be at home. So when you see this negatively sloped line, essentially what this is telling you is that when the tax rate is high, the hours worked per working age person is low. Not only is the work week shorter, that happens to be true, but also fewer people work. And that's what's showing up here. And so that's going to affect the growth rate, and that's what we tend to see. So that's what these data show, and that's what's reflected in it. And so that's why, again, there should be some ambiguity. Now let me go back to, just for one moment, let me talk a little bit about government policy. Does everybody remember the debate on the tax bill about a year and a half ago when we were all talking about this? Remember that? So I got a little bit involved in that. I went to the White House, went to Congress, talked to people about, just again, thinking about the economics of the tax thing. And if you recall, things were kind of flipped. The Republicans were saying, don't worry about the deficit, taxes low taxes are good. And all of a sudden, the Democrats were flipped the other way, and they said, oh, no, we got to worry about the deficit. Don't worry about the fact that we doubled the debt in 4 years. It's kind of, everybody was on the opposite side. So, all right, fine. That's the way it is. That's politics. We understand that's the way things work. Which side was right and which side was wrong? The answer is both sides were wrong, okay? And here's why. The Dems were wrong in the following sense. It is true that we don't want to run deficits. We understand that. But most of the time when you see a deficit, it's not because a country has cut taxes too much. It's because spending is high. So if you do a regression, simply just do an analysis of variance, for those of you who I know most of you are in the master's program by now, you know what analysis of variance is. If you just do a standard analysis of variance and you say how much of the deficit is explained by spending and how much of it is explained by taxes, about 80% is explained by spending. It's mostly spending. So the countries that are running big deficits, like Greece, got there not because they decided to cut their taxes too much. It's primarily because they spent too much, okay? So that's where the Democrats were wrong. Why were the Republicans wrong? The Republicans were wrong because what they were saying is that if you cut taxes, it's going to be magic and it's going to cause the economy to grow. What I just showed you in the past charts is that if you cut taxes but you don't cut spending, you're not going to get the growth, okay? So, because fundamentally, if you spent the money, you're going to have to pay for it eventually. You can either tax now or you can tax later, but you're going to have to tax. So unless you cut the spending, you're not going to get the growth. You will get some growth, but the reason you get the growth is because you go to a more efficient tax structure a less distortionary tax structure, not because there's something magic about low tax rates. That just doesn't work, okay? So that's essentially what was going on. All right, I see a lot of people. How many people in here from China? Okay, raise your hands. I was told that there are a lot of students from China, so I thought I would talk a little bit about China. Anybody from India in here? I have India on here as well. Okay, good. Couple people from India. Now, why do I say India and China? Well, the reason is that India and China account for a third of the world's population. So as India and China developed, China's a decade and a half or so, maybe even further in front of India, but both countries are still growing at rates well above what they grew historically. And so the question is, what will the world look like, the economic world? I'm not going to talk about the politics, but what will the economic world look like in a couple of decades with these very large countries growing? So let me just give you some perspective on this thing. You kind of know this, but it's pretty surprising when you actually look at this chart. If you go back just 20 years ago and you ask how large was the Chinese economy relative to the U.S. economy, it was about a tenth of the U.S. economy. In 2 decades, China has gone from being a tenth of the U.S. economy to almost 70% of the U.S. economy. So enormous. We know there's been enormous growth, but it's really amazing when you put it in that context. And even with slower growth, and this is a chart of the growth rates for China, even with slower growth, if you play out the 6% growth that we have now for China against the 2.5% to 3% growth rates that we have for the United States, and you estimate what that will be going forward, this says that those paths will cross in about 16 years. So we are now, the United States is still the largest economy in the world, but the estimate would be at these growth rates, within about 16 years, China will overtake the United States as the largest economy in the world, okay? And if it's not 16 years, maybe it's 18 years, maybe it's 14 years, but it's going to be somewhere in that neighborhood. So what? Who cares? Well, here's who cares. So if you look at the GDP rank in the world, it turns out large countries actually have a big advantage. What do I mean by large countries have an advantage? Well, you know, people forget. The United States is the third largest country in the world. We're not a small country. The 330 million people is a lot, and we are the largest of all the developed countries by far. And it's no surprise as a result that we also have the largest economy in the world for that reason. If you look at countries at the bottom of the chart, like Norway and Switzerland, those are very rich countries on a per-person basis. But they don't account for they're not going to be the biggest countries in the world because they're pretty tiny countries, pretty small countries. Switzerland's about 8 million, Norway's about 5 million. However, it turns out that you can still be rich even if you're small. To give you an example of this, we talked about this at lunch a bit. Does anybody remember who won the Winter Olympics this year? And I say won, it's not really won, but who got the most medals in the Winter Olympics? Anybody remember? Norway, right. Norway has 5 million people. China has 1.4 billion people. How could Norway outmedal China? It's impossible. I mean, China's 250 Norways. Yeah, I mean, I know Norway has snow and they have mountains, but China has snow and mountains too, okay? I mean, China has everything. So how could it be that if you have 250 times as many people? Well, it turns out it's not as straightforward as just looking at the ratios. And I actually have worked on this. I apologize to those of you. I talked a little bit about this earlier. I actually worked on this at a little more formal way, but this is actually a question of something called order statistics. How many people in here remember what an order statistic is? You remember what that is? Raise your hands. Come on. Be proud. Okay, good. A couple of you guys. Okay, so an order statistic is the following. What you want to know is if I'm drawing people from a distribution, say of a distribution of talent, I want to know what is the likelihood that the fastest downhill skier in the world will come from a population of 5 million versus one that came from a population of 1.4 or 1.5 billion, okay? What's the likelihood? There's some probability because it's kind of random, right? You know, you could get lucky, a Norwegian has really, really fast legs, genes, whatever. So I actually went out and looked at this, and it turns out is no way, okay? I mean, it can happen, but it almost never happens. It's pretty close to 1 in 250. It's a little bigger than that, but pretty close to that. So something else is going on. Now, what's going on is specialization. Norwegians, there's not a lot of great surfers from Norway, right? Because they don't have beaches like Santa Monica in Norway. So they specialize. Now, what you'll see is that if you look at the 3 richest countries in the world on a per capita basis, they are Monaco, Liechtenstein, and Luxembourg. Tiny, tiny little countries. Highly specialized, extremely specialized. What do? Well, Monaco has gambling, tourism, finance. What does Liechtenstein and Luxembourg have? Banking, finance, basically. There are no natural advantages there. It's not like, no one else in the world could mimic what Liechtenstein has done in terms of their banking or finance structure. Someone else could do it. Switzerland comes close to doing it. But they got, you may say they were in the right place at the right time. They got lucky, whatever. They got a formula that allowed them to specialize in certain things and made them very, very wealthy countries. And as a result, small countries can be very rich, but they can't dominate the world economy. So if you think about Liechtenstein and you say, Liechtenstein is way richer than Germany on a per capita basis, 5 times richer than Germany on a per capita basis, approximately. Which country in Europe has more influence, Liechtenstein or Germany? Yeah, obviously. Germany. So point is that while you can be wealthy on an individual basis, you cannot be wealthy as an economy, and you're not going to be as influential. And when people worry about the position of the United States vis-a-vis China, India, other countries in the world, what I think implicitly they're thinking about is not so much that we can't be rich on a per capita basis, but we're not going to be the biggest economy in the world. And the biggest economy in the world has tended to dominate politically as well. So if you think in history, again. All right, so what are threats to U.S. dominance? And I'm going to just go through this pretty quickly and then stop. Basically, there are 5 things that we have to think about. One is trade, and I want to talk about trade a little bit right now because obviously that's hot. That's a big topic that everybody's worried about. Talk a little bit about the budget, and then productivity, demographics, and human capital. So let me just show you real quickly what's going on. All right. Has anybody been following the tariff discussion, the Trump tariff discussion? Most of you have, I think, right? And as you know, President Trump decided to play hardball with both Canada and Mexico with respect to NAFTA, and also with China, a little bit with Europe as well, but the 3 main targets in recent months have been China, Canada, and Mexico. All right. Now, let's look at what he might have in mind. I don't know what he has in mind. I've never met him. I told you I was at the White House. I met all his, spent time with all his chief economic advisors. I've never met him. So I don't know exactly what's going on. But if there were a logic, let me try to explain what that logic would be, okay? All right. So here's the logic. All right, first of all, look at this chart. What does this chart say? This chart says trade is not an important issue for the United States. Now, that's a bit of an overstatement and an exaggeration. But if you look at trade as a proportion of GDP, what is trade? Sum of imports and exports. If you look at that for the U.S. as compared, say, to Germany, for the U.S. it's 20% of GDP. For Germany, it's 70% of GDP. When the recession hit in 2008, 2009, Germany got killed, really got killed. We all got killed, but Germany really got killed. Why? Because Germany was a big trading nation and all of their export markets just dried up immediately. So as a result of their inability to export, they suffered about a 17% drop in GDP right away. Ours was about a third of that, okay? So part of that, and it's the third again, reflects the fact that we just don't trade as much as Germany does. So Germany is a big exporting country. It mattered a lot to them. For us, it matters less. So the first thing one could say is trade's just not as big a deal to us as it is to other countries. But here's really the main argument. Now, I titled this, In Whose Living Room Does the American 800-Pound Gorilla Reside? Okay, and what that means is, if we're the 800-pound gorilla, who are we the 800-pound gorilla to? And if you look at this chart, what do you see? Who are the two countries that are most affected by us? Mexico and Canada. So if I ask, what proportion of GDP consists of exports to the United States? For Mexico, that number is 30%. 30% of Mexican GDP consists of exports to the United States. For Canada, it's 20%. Okay? What does that tell you? That tells you that if we were to stop importing from Canada and Mexico, that would throw those countries into the Great Depression, just without question. It would be an enormous blow to those countries. What about China? Look at China on that graph. Where's China? 4.5%. Okay? So China's a very different story. Obviously, China would not want to lose trade with the United States. An initial hit of 4.5% to GDP is not a good thing. But it's nowhere near in the same ballpark as we're talking about for Canada and Mexico. So let me show you one other number, and then I'll try to interpret what the Trump policies are about. So if you look at Canada and Mexico, and you say, okay, who are we exporting to? Who are our biggest export markets? They are Canada, Mexico, and China. That's true. Okay, so you'd say, well, seems like it's symmetric. Well, wait a minute. Look at the I put this in, apologies, I usually put this in percentage terms. I put this in absolute dollars. So if you look at the vertical axis, what are our exports to Canada, our number one exporting market? $350 billion. Does anybody know what GDP is in the United States? What is it? Yeah, 19, 20 trillion, right, exactly. So what that tells you is that our exports to Canada make up 1.7% of US GDP. Do you remember what the number was for Canada? 20%. Do you remember what the number was for Mexico? 30%. Big asymmetry. Big asymmetry. So if we lost Canada as an export market, we wouldn't like it, but it wouldn't throw us into the Great Depression. If Canada lost us as an export market, it would throw us into the Great Depression. My guess is someone in the White House knew that, okay? I'm not sure, but I would conjecture that they know these facts. And if you know those facts, it puts you in a tremendous bargaining position. So I interpret most of what the administration was doing in terms of their tariffs and threatened tariffs with respect to Canada and Mexico is essentially a bargaining game. With China, it's different. Why? Because, again, if we were to cut off all imports from China, what that would mean is about 2/3 a year's worth of growth for China, 4.5%. China grows at 6%. So 2/3, 3/4 of a year of growth, something like that. So I think probably what President Trump is thinking about, I don't know what, again, I don't want to attribute thoughts to the president. I don't know what he's doing. But if I were thinking about this logically, I would say to the extent that I want to have a protectionist policy, which I think is the wrong thing to be doing in the first place, but if I were going to do it, I would need a longer-term policy with respect to China. The bargaining strategy that I used with respect to Canada and Mexico is not going to have the same force when I'm dealing with China, because we're just not as big a gorilla in China as we are in Mexico and Canada. Okay, so that's what I think is up. All right, second point, debt. Where are we with respect to debt? Well, right now, our debt to GDP ratio is at about 75%. That's up, by the way, when I was in the White House and left, even with the TARP, it went up to 40%, so it's about a doubling. But that's not the scary part. The scary part is where we're going from here. Most of you know this, but again, when you see it on a chart, it's really pretty scary. Because what this says is that within a couple of decades, we're going to have deficits in the 7 to 8% range, and within 3 decades, we'll be at the 10% range. By the way, these numbers come from the Congressional Budget Office. So this is they're as close, for those of you who use government numbers, if you want the closest thing you're going to come to an unbiased number from the government, use the CBO's numbers. There's no such thing as nonpartisan in Washington, but they're about as clean as they come. So I always use the CBO's numbers as opposed to the Office of Management and Budget or Treasury's numbers. The CBO is a little bit cleaner. And if you look at their numbers, again, what this suggests is that we're going to be running close to 10% deficit. Now, if you run a 10% deficit per year, what that tells you is that within a decade, you have added 100% of GDP to the debt, and that's going to be a big problem. So in the long run, this is probably our most significant problem. We got to figure out a way to deal with this. We can tax, of course, and as I showed you on the previous few graphs ago, when you raise spending, you're going to have to raise taxes. So one way to get rid of that deficit is to tax. But what this would imply is an increase in taxes of about 50% across the board for all Americans, not just the rich, all Americans. You have to increase taxes by about 50% in order to pay for that deficit. So either we're going to do that, or we're going to have to figure out a way around that. All right. Another problem that we face. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, sir. Yeah, go ahead.
So your last comment saying all Americans meaning inflation?
No. What I meant, so let me give you a specific number. So right now, our tax to GDP ratio is at about 19%. Federal, this is federal. So that means if you look at payroll tax, that's the stuff that you do every, I know some of you guys aren't working, but the ones of the 3 or 4 of you in this room who actually have jobs, you guys, when you take your paycheck and it says FICA or long-term or Social Security, those things, that's about 9% of GDP. The other 10% of GDP is income tax, federal income tax. Add those together, you get 19%. If you want to eliminate the deficit, we would have to go to about 27, 28, 29%. So you'd essentially have to go up 1.5 times where we are now. And so that's what I mean by 50%, that we would have to take in somehow in revenues another 50% of tax revenues. There's not enough money at the top to do that, so it's going to have to be some kind of across-the-board tax. The most obvious one, since you asked, I wasn't going to get into it, but the most obvious one is a national VAT. So we have something like VATs in the United States. People don't call them that, but retail sales taxes they're not VATs, but they're kind of in the same genre. We don't have it at the federal level. Most countries in the world have it at the federal level. So that would be the obvious thing that you'd see is the initiation of like a 9-10% VAT at the federal level. By the way, countries always start small. Usually start, this, I mean, you're from Mexico, but if you look at Europe, you look at the UK, you look at Germany, they start at rates like 5-6% and end up at rates like 19 to 25%. So that's kind of the pattern. Okay. Productivity, another challenge for the future. Productivity, this is a big issue. So if you look at what's happened to productivity over time, what do you notice about that chart? You notice that the late 90s and 2000s were the high productivity period, early 2000s, and then it's kind of gone down. There's kind of a little bit of an encouraging uptick here at the end, so maybe things will get better. But without that, we're in a low productivity period. Why do we care about productivity? To me, I'm actually writing a book about productivity. This is, in my old age, I've decided I'm tired of dealing with journals, so I'm going to start writing books. And I'm writing a book on productivity, but it's primarily as productivity affects the standard of living of the typical worker. And I want to show you what that is. Here it is. So if you look at, this is a chart for the United States, and if you look at productivity growth rates and compensation changes, you see they tend to move together. Not perfectly. This is smooth, by the way. It's a 4-year moving average. But they do tend to move together. If you look across countries, it's even clearer. Countries with high productivity have high wages. It's even true for the poor. If you look at the poor in high productivity countries, they are richer than the poor in low productivity countries. So that's why we care about productivity. If productivity slows down, what that means is that the standard of living of the typical worker is going to slow down in terms of growth. So it's not just an abstract concept, it really relates to individuals and how well they live. And by the way, 1% is a lot. If you thought about the 1% decline in productivity that we saw, You run that over a generation, and it's the difference between the standard of living in the United States and the standard of living in Italy right now. So it's a pretty significant difference. This is not, again, stuff that's minor. Demographics. Most of you know this. I've talked about the baby boomers already. But if you look at the median age in the United States, it's gone up, and I'll show you that in a second. We're not as bad as some countries. The aging countries of the world, you know who they are. They're Japan, Germany, eventually China. China's getting there. They're not there yet, but China will, in part because of the one-child policy. You have a society that's aging. But if you look at this over time for the United States, what you'll see is back in 1970, the median age of the population in 1970 was 28. Play this forward to 2050, the median age will be 41. That's a huge increase. So that matters for a lot of reasons. It matters because business formation depends on demographics. Where's Hugo? I saw him. Good. Okay. So one of your professors is working on exactly this point right now, and actually has a pretty cool model where he talks about business formation, demographics, shares of compensation that the workers get relative to the amount that capital gets, and ties all that stuff together nicely. And it all relates to changes in demographics over time. So this stuff is really first order. And I suggest that you talk to Hugo if you're interested in that stuff. One other thing, and this is the one that I think of as the most important, and it's actually human capital production. And this is really the end. This is where I want to stop. In some sense, this is good news, okay? And the good news is that if we think about the United States and where we are in terms of human capital production, I don't have to tell this audience, because how many of you are from outside the United States? I know many said from China. How many not from the United States? Raise your hands. Okay. How many from the United States? Okay, so pretty good. So I'd say about a third from the United States, 2/3 not from the United States. So we are good at producing human capital at the top level. What I did, by the way, this is easy to do. Go on the internet, get rankings of top universities in the world. There are a few of them. These seem to be the three that come up most often if you do a search. They all basically tell you the same thing. They tell you that most of the top universities are in the United States. So that's good news. Why? Because the way you get productivity growth is primarily through human capital. Why? Because human capital creates technology. You don't get technology without human capital. And so the fact that we're really good at producing human capital, it takes a long time for this to turn around, by the way. Universities maintain their positions for long, long periods of time. UK, even during periods when it was very poor and having real trouble, still had among the best universities in the world, with Oxford, Cambridge, LSE, places like that. So we're likely to be able to maintain this position for a long time. That's good, but remember that while we produce the information, that doesn't necessarily mean we'll be the consumers of the information. We know that information is a public good. What does that mean? It means that lots of people can consume it simultaneously, and it spreads very quickly. So this is what we have going. This is going to be an area of specialization for us. It's an area of strength for the United States. It's also going to be a big export, as it is already, and as is evidenced by the people in this room. Let me stop there and open it up for discussion and questions. Any thoughts? Yeah, sir.
Your chart on the disabilities.
Yeah. You want me to go back? Let me see if I can do it. Hang on. I think, did I go too far? No? Yeah, let me do, yep, go ahead.
With taxation, wouldn't that also apply in item 61? At some point, it's going to be a greater effort to keep working
Yeah.
than it is to start consuming my wealth that I've seen.
Yeah.
So when you go to the slide a few farther, with
Yep.
the countries that are high spenders,
What's about me?
what's the prognosis for those people,
This one.
the Denmarks, the Belgiums that are spending more money than
Yeah.
they're creating?
Okay, so so you kind of put two questions together in the same question. Let me see if I can answer the second one first, and then see if I've nailed your first one. So the second one is this, that if you look at countries like Denmark, they are rich, but they're not growing. Well, but they are rich. So how did they get to be rich? Well, they must have grown in the past, okay? So what that tells us is that at one time, they were positive pro-growth economies. And they have decided, again, to move slightly away from that. Sweden actually moved back. So if you look at Sweden in the early 90s, they had very high tax rates. Sweden actually decided that it was hurting their growth rate too much, and there was a commission headed by a guy named Asserlindbeck, very distinguished Swedish economist. And they decided that the tax rates were simply too high, and because of people like you, 61-year-olds are kind of on the margin of thinking, should I work or should I shirk, right? And you decide, well, you raise my tax rate, I'm going to go from work to shirk, right? So they realized that and decided to lower tax rates. And in fact, growth rates in Sweden did respond. You do see higher growth rates. So the point is that you can integrate that. Again, it's a policy decision. It's the kind of thing that people decide, what do we want to do? How do we want to spend our wealth? Norway's had tremendous wealth, in part because of their oil fields, and they got lucky. But they decided to spend a lot of it in the form of social insurance and transfer payments. That was just a decision that they made. It also has affected their growth rates, though, as well. So I think, does that answer you? Yeah, good, yeah.
So, regarding some of the last slides you presented, what things about immigration?
Yeah, good.
Well, there's usual thoughts about it.
That's not exactly a plant, but almost. Okay. I have a lot of thoughts about immigration. Let me tell you a few things. So one of the things about immigration, right now, if you look at growth of our population, and you look at, again, census puts out numbers, they project what's going to happen to work, to hours of work. And remember I told you that we were aging, and that means that puts negative pressure. That means that if it were just for that, if we thought about it as organic growth, we would actually be seeing declines in the amount of work. But that's not actually projected. What is projected is pretty much level in terms of organic growth, and I say organic meaning natural growth from the current population. But because we bring in about 1 million immigrants per year, and because in that group we get about 60% or so working, that contributes about another 0.4 to growth every year, 0.4%. So that's where we get it. So immigration is key for future growth in terms of hours of work. It's absolutely essential if we want to deal with that. People always think of it in terms of the fiscal situation, that, if you have all these old guys, you need to have young guys paying for the old guys. And who are the young guys? The young guys are the immigrants. The young people are immigrants, and they tend to work, and they tend to be also highly entrepreneurial. So that was the second point I was going to make. I've been doing some research on this as well recently. And let me give you a fact. So how many people think that immigrants are more entrepreneurial than the native-born population? How many think that's true? Okay, good, it's true, okay. It's true, but it's widely varied. And I want to give you a surprising statistic. If you had to pick the country that supplies the most entrepreneurs, which country would that be? It's obvious, if you think about it for a second. Who is it? Right, the man that asked the question, okay? Mexico, has to be Mexico, right? Because Mexico has 4 times as many immigrants in the United States as any other country. On a per capita basis, it might surprise you, though, who are the most entrepreneurial immigrants. Number 1 is Israel, okay? Number 1 is Israel. Now you say, oh yeah, the Israelis are entrepreneurial. Well, not true. In Israel actually has a low rate of entrepreneurship. Israelis in Israel are not very entrepreneurial. They have some great companies, spectacular companies, Teva, biotech. You can think about companies in Israel that have been very successful. But on a per capita basis, they're not that high. In the United States, they're number 1. Number 2 is Iran. Number 3 is Syria. Number 4 is Lebanon. Number 5 is Greece. Yeah. I thought that would surprise you, okay? So the point is that much of this has to do with selection. It's not about the inherent features of the country itself. It's who's coming in. And And if you think about who's coming in, if you're coming in from Iran, it's pretty hard to get in from Iran. So I have a very distinguished young Iranian colleague, a very smart guy, who's one of the best hires we've made in the past few years. This guy's terrific. But it wasn't that easy for him to get into the United States. How did he get in? Because he was one of the brightest people in Iran. So he got into the United States. If you're thinking about this, it's not a random selection of the population. If you come from Syria, it's not that easy to get in from Syria. If you come from Lebanon, it's not that easy to get in from Lebanon. So much of this has to do with our policies, our selection, not so much about policies on the other side. So there are plenty of smart people in every country in the world, and we're in the enviable position of essentially saying we can have our pick. If we want people, we can get people from virtually every country in the world. So I don't know if that answers your question, but hopefully addresses some of it. Other questions? Other thoughts? Yeah, please. Simon, how you doing? He's a student of mine, sort of. Yeah.
Wonderful experience. So I was wondering how you could square this chart with the micro estimates of elasticity of labour, in which my impression is labour supply is at least for working age people is pretty vertical. Yeah. Maybe it's mainly with the early retirements.
It's actually extensive versus intensive margin, okay? So when we do labor supply stuff, normally what we're doing with labor supply is we're thinking about the working population and what will be the effect, say, of tax rates on hours of work. Or if I raise your wages, you're already working, what will be the effect of raising your wages on your hours of work? And the answer is not very much, because you're going to go to the beach anyway, right? So that margin is pretty inelastic. What's a little more elastic is the extensive margin. And the best evidence on that actually is the stuff on the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit. So I don't know if you know Hillary Hoyne's stuff on this. She's probably done the most work on that. But if you look at her work, the intensive margin, there's almost no elasticity, but the extensive margin about pulling people into the labor force actually works. So most of what I'm picking up here, I think, is not the intensive margin. It's not the fact that when you lower taxes, you get longer work weeks. It's primarily the fact that when you lower taxes and you raise wages, you get a higher proportion of the population working. And so I think that's what's going on, and that squares it. Go ahead, yeah, you were going to say something.
The difference between my stereotype of France, where they have this 40-hour norm, 35-hour norm, yeah. And so I wonder if there's something else driving, if there's some broader cultural thing, there's a norm, everyone else is working 35 hours, you don't work 7 hours. Whereas in the US, to prosper, you have to work as many hours as your younger colleagues. And so to what degree is actually changes in taxes that's driving this versus maybe taxes are a consequence of some different cultural.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. You think the French are lazy, but that's because you got a British accent. So, actually, I'll tell you, the French have among the highest productivity workers in the world. You probably know that, but it's actually true. Their hours of work are low, but French have very high productivity per hour. So Brits work longer hours, but you guys just, not as effective. It could be. I always think of the norms as being somewhat endogenous. So, I wouldn't take the norms as given. I would essentially say, look, if you have a country that's like France, which, by the way, spends 45% of GDP through the government, if you're going to spend that much, you're going to have to tax that much. If you've made that decision, essentially what you're telling me is that you've decided to have a lower work hour society, and so that's incorporated into the norms. The 35-hour work week was actually not a law, and it's come down over time. Germany has the same thing, by the way. Germany actually is a low work society. So if you look at Germany's hours of work, they're quite low. Italy and France are the lowest, but Germany is next. In Germany, the norm is 6 weeks of vacation. So I think the law is actually 4 weeks. I think you are required to give 4 weeks, but the norm is actually 6 weeks of paid vacation a year. So it's not so bad. I mean, when you look at this stuff, remember, I was focusing on growth rates. When you look at this stuff, you kind of say, which country has it backwards? The United States, we're working our tails off, and the French are working, a third time less, and they got great wine and great food and, pretty nice life. So, maybe they have it, maybe they're the guys that have it right. But the point is it does show up in growth rates. That's essentially all I was saying. It's not necessarily that one country's doing it right and the other country's doing it wrong, but simply that it has consequences for growth. So, good. Lee, please.
Can I just follow up on that discussion? So
Yeah.
in the 1960s, France and Germany and a lot of those European countries had lower tax rates than the U.S. And their hours per adult were all much higher than the U.S. in the 1960s. So we have to be sort of this overtime shift towards leisure that we have to use to explain that.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, that's why I said I always take norms as endogenous, but I think Lee's way of putting it is better. That when you see changes, you got to be able to explain. A good theory says you can explain it, and it can be refuted by the data, right? So if you have a theory of norms, of course, you can always make up a theory of norms that will fit the data. But I think the problem you're going to have with that is then, you have to say, well, how would I refute that theory? And if I see this change over time, does it accommodate that? It's pretty hard, actually, as you know, it's pretty hard to get time series stuff right. So when you're looking at the time series, if you're trying to predict when something happens, for example, that's a lot harder to do than predicting something in the cross-section. The cross-section is just a lot easier. That's why I'm a labor economist, because you can use cross-sectional data. So. Any other last questions? I've told you I'd try to let you out at 6:15. It's pretty close to that now. So unless there's, okay, one burning question, one last one. Go ahead.
Why is productivity growth slowing down?
Okay, good question. Why is productivity growth slowing down? There are three theories that I know of anyway. One is secular stagnation. The secular stagnation theory it actually arose in the 30s during the Great Depression. By a Keynesian economist, famous Keynesian economist named Alvin Hansen, and he basically said there's not enough demand. So what we need to do is pump up demand. This was part of the Keynesian stuff, stimulus stuff that you saw in the 30s. That theory went out of business in about the 1940s because basically the economy took over, everything turned out all right. And by the way, that happened before we entered World War II. So if you look at when growth rates picked up, it actually picked up in 39 and 40 before we entered the war. So didn't look like that worked. It's been resurrected in recent years. My successor, the guy who was President Obama's chief economist, Larry Summers, and a good friend, has been pushing this secular stagnation story. I think that one's, to be honest, I think that one is losing steam too, again, because we've seen so much growth in the past year or so, and it kind of looks like it wasn't a failure of demand. He's got some points if you look at interest rates and rates of return, real rates of return, some suggestion that there's something there, but looks like that one's not there. The second theory is, I would say, Bob Gordon's theory. So Bob Gordon at Northwestern, which is all the cool stuff's already been invented and there's no good stuff to find anymore. So, he has a book on this. I forget what it's called. It's a pretty cool book. Lots of anecdotes. But, it's essentially, if you look at the 20th century, it's an amazing period. Industrial revolution, you have going from human and animal power to machine power, tremendous transformation and the kinds of things that went on then, going to be hard to replicate. That's his argument. Maybe, maybe not. If you were thinking about the information communications technology revolutions that occurred in the 80s and 90s, no one would have predicted that stuff. We saw a huge productivity boom at the end of the 90s. So maybe, but I would say there's no compelling either conceptual, theoretical argument for that, nor is there strong empirical evidence that suggests that's the case. The third point is essentially luck. And when I say luck, let's see if I can find the graph. If you look, I'm going the wrong way. Sorry. If you look at productivity over time, there it is. if you look at productivity over time, what you see are there are spurts and there, troughs and peaks, right? Good periods, bad periods. And so there was a good period in, as I said, late 90s, early 2000s. We were wondering why this didn't happen in the 80s and 90s. It was actually called the productivity puzzle because we had all this great invention and it didn't show up and then it showed up later. It's hard to say, it's kind of what I was saying with Simon, it's really hard to explain the time series. It's hard to know when something's going to happen and when it's going to take off. So one could argue that some of this stuff is luck. And of course, the people who are out of power will argue that it's bad policy. The people who are in power will say, well, we just had bad luck. This is election day, so that kind of brings it back to that. I would say it's a combination of probably of the two. I would say most of it is probably luck, but there were some policies certainly over the past decade or so that were not pro-investment for sure. And one could argue that those policies, regulation, taxes, that kind of stuff, one could argue those policies changed, and so we see a little bit of an uptick here. Of course, President Trump wants to argue this is a turnaround, and you're going to get sick of winning. We'll see. But I'll just leave it at that and let you go watch the returns. So, thanks very much.